An old woman sat at the edge of the road, slouching as if the world she knew had shrunk to the size of the cardboard sheet she held in her trembling fingers. Rough hands, cracked by cold and time, clutched a sign that read indistinctly, "Please help, my family needs." The letters blurred further, erased by moisture, perhaps rain, perhaps tears. She was wrapped in a Ukrainian flag, its colors faded, its edges frayed, but its symbol unchanged. The fabric fell over her shoulders like a cloak, sheltering her from the wind, but not from the reality that weighed heavily on her exhausted shoulders. People passed by, the rare passers-by, like shadows, disappearing into the depth of the street, avoiding her gaze, pretending not to notice. Some just passed by, others stopped for a moment, but immediately turned away, unable to bear the silent reproach in her eyes. But he did not pass by. The man stopped in front of her, casting a shadow on the cracked sidewalk. He didn't need to read the words on the cardboard to know that the woman needed help. He could see it in her eyes, tired, full of pain, but still alive. He was dressed simply, an olive green t-shirt, reminiscent of wartime, and a light tactical jacket scuffed at the elbows. His thick, dark beard was faintly covered with strands of grey, as if every night without sleep had left its mark on him. His brown eyes were deep, filled with determination, but there was no coldness in them, only weariness and warmth. "What is your name?" he asked softly, squatting down beside the woman. She looked up, as if not believing that someone had actually stopped, actually asked. "Maria," she answered, barely audible. "Maria," he repeated, as if memorizing. "Are you cold?" She nodded. He took the jacket off her shoulders and gently slipped it over her shoulders. "Is that better?" The woman nodded again, but her lips were trembling from more than just the cold. He looked at her plaque, at her haggard face, at her trembling fingers clutching the edges of the cardboard. "Your family, where are they?" Maria turned away, covering her eyes with her palm, as if afraid that if she said it out loud, it would become a reality that could not be fought. "In the village," she said at last. "My daughter and grandchildren are there. There's no food, no light. I came here to look for help, but—" She was silent. He nodded, stood up, took money out of his pocket and put it in her palm. "Will this be enough?" The woman looked at the bills, then back at him. "It's too much." He smiled. "It's enough." She clutched the money tightly, as if afraid it was a mirage, that it would disappear as soon as she blinked. "Thank you," she whispered. The man only nodded, then straightened, ran a hand through his hair, and looked around the street. Maria hesitated, but there was no pressure or order in his voice, only concern. "Good." He helped her up, supporting her under his elbow. They walked down the street, where the gloomy windows of abandoned stores reflected the silhouette of a man who could not pass. Vladimir Zelensky is not just a passerby here. He is the president of the country, a leader who was not afraid to take to the streets and see with his own eyes the suffering of his people. But now, at this moment, he is not the president. Now he is just a man who stopped in front of a woman in need of help. Maria walked slowly, as if every movement was difficult for her. Zelensky carefully supported her by the elbow, feeling how fragile her body had become, like an autumn leaf, ready to snap and fly away at the first gust of wind. They were walking down a deserted street, where once there had been stores and children's laughter, but now there was an oppressive silence. "Where are we going?" Maria asked quietly, her voice trembling with uncertainty. "To the volunteer center," answered Zelensky. "There is food, warmth, help there. You won't have to sit on the street anymore." She nodded weakly, but Zelensky noticed her fingers gripping the edge of the flag tighter, as if it were the last thread linking her to home. He understood the feeling. He himself clung to the country the same way she clung to that piece of cloth. You're the one," Maria said suddenly, casting a quick glance at him. Zelensky grinned. "Yes, that's me." She fell silent. "I didn't recognize you at first," she said at last. "You don't look like—" She didn't finish, but Zelensky understood what she wanted to say. "The president?" He smiled. "Yes. I thought presidents didn't walk the streets like that. In other times, maybe they don't," he replied. "But these are different times." Maria nodded again, but there was an expression on her face that Zelensky had seen 100 times before, a mixture of hope, fatigue, and disbelief that someone could just come and help. Do you still believe? She asked suddenly. Believe what? That all this will end. He looked at her. I don't just believe, he said. I know. Maria held his gaze for a moment, then turned away, her eyes staring up at the grey sky. Knowing, that's good, she whispered. I would have been like this a long time ago. Zelensky didn't answer anything. They reached the corner where a building with broken windows and a peeling sign stood. A faint light burned inside. A volunteer center. We're here, he said. Let's go. Maria stepped forward, but stopped suddenly and looked at him. You weren't just walking down the street, were you? Zelensky grinned. True. Then why did you stop? He looked her straight in the eye. Because I couldn't pass by. Maria nodded, as if accepting that answer. The volunteer center was a modest but warm place. Inside it smelled of hot soup and tea, and the air was saturated with soft conversations in which both hope and fatigue were evident. A few people were sitting at tables, some eating, some just warming their frozen hands with a cup of hot water. Maria hesitated on the threshold, as if afraid that she would lose something by crossing the threshold. Zelensky sensed her hesitation and touched her shoulder lightly. There's help for you here, he said. Maria sighed and nodded. They approached the counter, behind which stood a young woman in a knitted sweater, with slightly disheveled hair but kind eyes. She looked at Maria, then at Zelensky, and her eyes widened with surprise. Jesus! Zelensky gave her a slight nod, as if to let her know, not now. This woman needs help, he said. She has family in the village, but they're in dire straits. Can we organize the delivery of food, medicine there? The volunteer quickly pulled herself together. Of course. We will do our best. She looked at Maria and smiled softly. Come in, sit down, I'll bring you some tea. Maria stepped forward, but suddenly turned to Zelensky again. Will you stay? He glanced at her. I must be going, but I won't forget about you. She nodded. Thank you then. And she walked on, slouching, but no longer so lonely. Zelensky stood at the entrance, watching as volunteers carefully covered her with a warm blanket and placed a plate of hot soup in front of her. Mr. President, the volunteer said softly. Yes? It's unusual, seeing you here, like this. He grinned. It's unusual not to see your own people now. The woman nodded, not knowing what else to say. If you need anything, contact my people. Of course. Zelensky looked at Maria once more, then turned and walked back out into the cold evening. He walked again through the empty streets, where the wind carried scraps of old newspapers and past lives. The war had changed everything, but as long as he could just stop like that, reach out, he was still the man he was supposed to be. A man who does not pass by. The wind picked up, howling through the empty windows of the broken houses. Zelensky walked slowly down the street, his thoughts occupied with Maria, her eyes full of fatigue and bitterness. He knew that there were thousands, millions like her, but why was she the one who caught his eye? Why was she the one he couldn't just leave behind, like he did with so many stories he heard every day? His fingers fumbled for his cell phone in his pocket. He opened the contact list and tapped the name he wanted. Alexei. The voice on the other end of the line was alert but tense. Find information on a woman named Maria. She was at the volunteer center on Center Street today. Find out where she's from, who her family is, and what their problems are. There was a brief pause on the other end. Is something wrong? I don't know yet. Zelensky looked at the dim lantern light casting long shadows on the cracked asphalt. But I want to know for sure. I'll give you an answer in an hour. The connection went dead. Zelensky put the phone away and quickened his step. He knew it could have been a coincidence. An ordinary woman who had lost everything like thousands of others. But there was something in her gaze that kept him on his toes. Something akin to fear. A little over an hour passed. He was sitting in a dark room, lit only by the laptop screen, when the phone vibrated again. Alexei, he said, picking it up. Found her. But there's something strange. Zelensky straightened up. Go ahead. Maria Kolomichuk, 67 years old, really lived in a village near the front line. But her family, her daughter and grandchildren, are no longer there. Cold ran down Zelensky's back. What do you mean, no longer there? They died 2 months ago. The house was destroyed in the shelling. The information was confirmed by local volunteers. Zelensky slowly ran his palm across his face. But she said they were waiting for her. Either she's lying, or she just doesn't know. There was silence for a moment. Do you think she could be lying? Zelensky asked. Maybe. But why? Zelensky did not answer. There were dozens of questions running through his mind, but the main one was, who was this woman really? The next morning, he returned to the volunteer center again. Maria was sitting in the corner, wrapped in a plaid, slowly drinking tea. She looked better than yesterday, but the same heaviness still lived in her eyes. Zelensky sat down opposite her. How are you? She smiled slightly. Warm. It hadn't been this warm in a long time. He nodded, pondering the next question. Yesterday you said your family was waiting for you. Maria froze, subtly squeezing the edge of the plaid. Yes. Zelensky watched her reaction carefully. Are you sure? She raised her eyes to him. What are you saying? Number, she whispered. Zelensky continued to speak softly but firmly. Your family is no longer there. Maria's lips trembled. She turned away, staring into the void. Who are you, Maria? He asked. She was silent, then slowly closed her eyes. I can't tell you. Zelensky tensed. Why? She took a deep breath. Because it would put you in danger. A wave of tension went through his body. He had seen many people who had survived the war, many who had lost everything. But Maria, she knew more than she was saying. I've been threatened before, Zelensky said. I'm used to danger. No, she shook her head. This is different. He waited. Finally, she looked into his eyes. I saw something I shouldn't have seen. Zelensky clenched his hands into fists. What was it? Maria took a breath and leaned closer. The ones who came to our village after the shelling, the Russian military? She shook her head. Number, men in black. No insignia. They were taking something from the destroyed houses. Looking for something. Zelensky frowned. What was it? Maria shook her head. I don't know. But I saw them find someone's cell phone. And after that, the people who saw them were gone. Zelensky exhaled slowly. He knew that war wasn't just battles and fronts. It's also about secrets, the ones they don't talk about. Are you sure? Yes, her voice was firm. Zelensky leaned closer. If it's true, you need protection. Maria grinned bitterly. Do you think I just ended up here like that? He realized that she was right. She wasn't just some random old lady. She was running. Zelensky sat across from Maria, scrutinizing her face. Everything was different now. This wasn't just a story about a poor woman who had lost her home. This was a secret that could change the course of the war. Tell me everything, he said quietly. Maria hesitated. If I tell you, I'll be killed. They already want to kill you, Zelensky replied stiffly. She looked at him, and understanding flashed in her eyes. Good, she whispered. She took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. I am indeed from that village. And my family, they died. But I couldn't stay there, because I saw something I shouldn't have. Zelensky stepped forward. Those men in black, they weren't Russian? No. Maria shook her head. They spoke Ukrainian. He frowned. Are you saying they were ours? I don't know who they were, but they were looking for something among the ruins. I hid in the basement of a ruined house and saw them pulling out bodies, going through things. What did they find? The phone. Zelensky pressed his lips together. What kind of phone? I don't know. But when one of the soldiers turned it on, they immediately called somewhere. Then one of them said, find the owner. If he's alive, eliminate him. A chill ran down Zelensky's back. The next day they started killing people who could see something. She clenched her hands. They killed my neighbor. He was just standing by the well. Then they killed the teacher. I realized that if I stayed, I would be next. She fell silent, then added, They were looking for me, Mr. President. Silence hung in the room. Zelensky thought deeply. Unmarked men killing witnesses. A mysterious cell phone being hunted. How did you escape? I crawled through the woods that night, walked until my legs refused to go. Volunteers found me on the highway, took me back to town. Why didn't you tell them sooner? Because I didn't know who I could trust. Zelensky nodded. He understood her fear, but now that fear had become his problem. He stood up. You need protection. I'll send men with you. Maria looked at him gratefully, but suddenly, there was a thud from somewhere outside. Zelensky turned sharply toward the door. Stay here. Zelensky kept his eyes on the black car. His intuition told him that he could not wait. He returned to Maria, sat down opposite, and said softly, "They found you." Her fingers clutched at the plaid. "What do we do?" "Leave. Right now." Zelensky took out his phone and dialed Alexei again. "The car is watching us. Send people right away." "On my way," Alexei replied. Zelensky glanced at the door. Time was playing against them. The minutes stretched agonizingly slow. And suddenly, the black car moved from the place. It drove smoothly forward, slowed down in front of the center. Then it stopped. Zelensky felt a rush of adrenaline. "Get ready." He didn't know who was inside, but he knew one thing: we can't wait. He turned to the volunteer standing next to him. "Do you have an emergency exit?" "Yeah." "Through the kitchen. Lead the way." Maria stood up, her legs trembling, but her gaze remained steady. They went through the narrow corridor, into the kitchen. Zelensky looked out the window. In the yard stood an old gazelle. "Into this car, quickly." They ran out into the yard. Zelensky first sat behind the wheel, Maria next to him. "Hold on." The car sped off. Behind, near the center, a black car noticed movement. The door opened. 3 men in black jackets stepped out. One of them looked in the direction of the departing gazelle. "They're leaving," he said into the walkie-talkie. The reply was short, "Catch them." Zelensky drove the car through the narrow streets. "Where are we going?" Maria asked. "Someplace safe." The phone rang. "Alexei, we see you're being tailed." "How many?" 3, armed. "Where are our men?" "We'll be there in 2 minutes." "Hold on." Zelensky swore. In the rearview mirror, he saw the black car approaching. "Shit," he whispered. The car sped up, and then the first shot rang out. The bullet pierced the rear window. Maria cried out. Zelensky gripped the steering wheel. "Hold on." He made a sharp turn into a narrow alley. The black car followed them. And suddenly, a military SUV came around the corner at full speed. Zelensky recognized the plates. "Ours?" The truck crashed into the side of the black car, throwing it into the wall. There was a thud. Black figures tumbled out of the car, trying to get up, but immediately they were surrounded by Special Forces fighters. Zelensky braked sharply, exhaled. They were saved. But he knew it wasn't over. He got out of the car and approached the prisoners. One of them, the wounded one, looked at him and grinned. "You can't hide." Zelensky leaned closer. "Who sent you?" Silence. "What was on the phone?" The man was silent. Then Zelensky straightened up. "We'll find out for ourselves." He looked at Alexei. "Take care of them, and find that phone." Later, in a safe hiding place, Maria was able to relax for the first time in a long time. "Is that it now?" Zelensky shook his head. "It's just beginning." And somewhere far away, in another dark room, someone was looking at the screen where there was a shot of Zelensky. Someone's voice said, "He's learned too much," and pressed the call button. Let's proceed to phase 2.